Testing. How am I doing on this microphone, guys? Okay. There are so many of you. Thank you all for coming to hear me talk. I'm speechless by how many of you there are. This is great. Thank you. So this is what I'm talking about today. I'm just going to talk about how I use Symfony, because we never open source the applications that we write using Symfony. Those of us who help work on Symfony and the other projects in the ecosystem. So I thought I would talk to you guys about how I use Symfony when I'm actually writing an application with it. This is my favorite part of the show, the presentation. Watch this. Everyone get your cameras out. So that's me. You can find me around the internet with that name. Here's some words about me. One of these is not true. There. I'm a lover, not a hater. I just wanted to say that. I am the lead developer on Ascetic, which is an asset management library in PHP. Also on Buzz, which is a little HTTP request client library. And Spork, which is a very experimental library for forking PHP into multiple processes using the process control functions. I think it's important to note that the only reason, or I don't know if it's the only reason, but I'm up here because I raised my hand a few years ago. I started using Symfony 5 or 6 years ago, back in the Symfony 1, pre-1 days, and went off, just saw there was a Symfony camp, is what it was called back then, in Amsterdam, and found a cheap flight from Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm from, to Amsterdam direct. Was in there, and all the guys that you see online were up there, and then we were having a conversation about, what was it? Apparently this was the second year that the camp had happened, so people were saying, we talked about all this stuff last year, nothing happened, what can we do to make sure things happen? And they said, we should have a community manager. And then they said, who wants to be it? And I raised my hand. So the point of all that is that you guys should all feel very welcome to raise your hand in this community and become a part of it. There's no barriers. Just if you want to get involved, raise your hand, start doing something, and you'll become a valuable member of the community. And let's see. I think that's enough. Yeah, we can move on. Getting started. It's a kitten. It's a greenfield kitten, right? Okay. Greenfields is how we start every project. So just like Fabian was talking about earlier, Composer, I use Composer to get a project started. Using this command, it'll clone the standard edition and get you started with an application. I make a few changes to the Composer file. I use Mongo most of the time. I don't want to sound like every single application should be written using Mongo, but that's where I start. If there's a compelling reason to use something else, then I'll do that. There are a few other bundles that are not included in the standard edition that are listed there as well. I'll start with a bundle called main bundle. You got to start somewhere. I'll talk later about how I organize my code in different bundles. But just to get started, I have something there called main bundle. And then this little ditty is inside of the kernel, inside of app kernel, for loading the container configuration. So there's the standard edition comes with parameters.yaml, but that really only works with parameters as far as overriding things for your particular environment goes. I prefer overriding things, to have more flexibility overriding things, and so it actually requires a second configuration tree, which we load in here. And so you'd have your ignore file and get configured to ignore any local .yaml files there. I want to start by talking about the model and how I think about the model, what belongs in the model, what doesn't belong in the model. And I've come up with this. You should treat your model like a princess. You could just pick one of these. Or has anyone seen Downton Abbey? There's probably people in here who've seen more Downton Abbey than I have, because I'm a silly American and we don't get it for like another 6 months or something. But Downton Abbey, so maybe I should come back to this later, but there's the family, and then there's all the people that work for the family. So this will all start to make sense, don't worry. She, the princess, your model, gets its own wing of the palace. So what that means is that you take those model classes, and instead of having to figure out, okay, which bundle should this model go in, just take your model classes and put them all in their own namespace. And this is the namespace in which you model the problem which your application is solving. So the model, what I mean by model is the classes that maintain state, or the persistent classes in your application. So they'll model the state of your application. Take all of those out of Symfony. The beauty of Doctrine is that there's no longer a base class, so you can model your application in PHP without it being tightly coupled to any particular framework or library or base class. So just think of this model directory. This model directory is a very special place where you have your PHP classes that model the problem that your application solves, set aside from everything else. So with that configuration I just showed you, you'd be able to get a repository using that model, alias model :user would give you the repository for the user class. So coming back to this princess analogy, the princess has her own wing of the castle and she doesn't do any work. Or if the Downton Abbey family, they don't actually do anything. I don't quite understand how they got that gig, but they don't do anything. Everyone else does the work for them. So that is how your model should operate too. Your model shouldn't actually do anything. So here's an example. If you're setting the username, let's say we have this is the way the FOSS user bundle works. You have a username field, and then you have a username canonical field, which is kind of normalized or canonicalized. And this is one way to do it. This is an example of the model doing too much. So it's reaching out for the canonicalizer and getting that from a singleton and then using it to create the username canonical field. So I think most of us are familiar with dependency injection now, if you've been using Symfony, I hope, and you can see right away that this kind of static singleton business is not good. So you might solve that by, whenever you set the username, you also pass along this canonicalizer. Still, this is too much for the model to be doing. So the model doesn't do any work, and it's also unaware of work that happens around it. So your setter would just look like this, and then a listener will come in later, the listener being the servants around the Downton Abbey family, whatever their name was, I forgot. And then it'll come in later once this class gets into the persistence layer, and set the username canonical field. Okay, so I gave this talk in February, and someone came up to me afterwards and asked me about this thing called the anemic domain model. Told me it was an anti-pattern, and it's basically what I was describing. So, I mean, I've read up on this. Maybe someone here can explain to me after the talk why this is bad, but it's not making any sense why this is bad. With the tools that we work with, this is a very clean solution. So anemic, do we need to give the princess a hamburger? I don't think so. This is what Martin Fowler says. The fundamental horror of this anti-pattern is that it's so contrary to the basic idea of object-oriented design, which is to combine data and process together. Is it? I mean, I just disagree with him. And hopefully by the end of the talk, as I take you through the rest of what I'm going to talk about, you'll agree with me. I welcome you to come find me afterward and disagree with me, if you can tell me why. He's talking about combining, what was he saying, data and process as object-oriented design. So I'm trying to understand what that means. You have this example that I know Cal Evans uses a lot, and I think it's kind of a basic example that people might use to help you understand object-oriented programming. So you have a cabinet, that's an object, and on that there's a method called open to open the cabinet. My point is that, at least in my house, cabinets don't open themselves, right? There's something that comes along and opens the cabinet, and then the cabinet has a state of open. But there's something else that comes along and does that work. In a more practical real-world example, inside of Ascetic recently, when we first built Ascetic version 1, every asset has this method getLastModified. So this would be, if you have a file like main.js, getLastModified would just get the M time of that file and return it back to you. The problem that we ran into is that with say a SAS, if you have a preprocessor running that spits out your CSS and then it includes other partials, then the M time of this asset is actually the M time, or what would it be, the highest M time of all the assets that it relies on. So it would need to scan through that current asset and then look for any children of that asset and then scan through them. And when it's looking at the children, it's going to need to use the asset factory to actually create that child, and then again, kind of on and so on and so on. So once you get into it, that's way too much work for the asset file, which in my mind is the same as a model. It's kind of the state of your asset. It's way too much work for that file to be doing. So it's implemented now. We have the factory looking at an asset and then going through its children recursively and coming up with the highest M time that it's able to find, and that becomes the last modified time for that file, for that asset. So I don't know how clear I was, but we'll come back to a lot of this. Moving on, though, I want to talk a little bit about mapping layers, and this will tie into the model also. Mapping layers are when you're looking at your application and trying to figure out what code belongs where, I think a good place to start is to identify where are the mapping layers. A mapping layer is a very thin layer that takes something from one system or one language or one world and maps it into another world. So that layer should be very thin. It shouldn't do much other than that mapping, taking one thing and turning it into another thing. So when I say thin, you might think of thin controller fat model, right? This is a phrase that's bandied around quite a bit in the world of MVC. So the question becomes, is Symfony an MVC framework? And Fabian's not in here, so I can't ask him. But The answer is really no. Symfony is not built to be an implementation of MVC. Symfony is built to be an HTTP framework. It's built to take a request in and turn it around and give you a response. So it's built to do that and to do it well and to do it quickly. It's not the primary aim of Symfony is not to implement MVC. Of course, you can implement MVC inside of Symfony if you would like. So, thinking of it from that perspective, you have HTTP land on one side, and then your application land on the other side. And in between the two is a mapping layer, which is the controller, right? So if mapping layers are to be thin and just simply map information from one world into another world, if we're coming from HTTP land and then we want to work with the information we get from HTTP inside of our application, then the mapping layer is the controller. The controller has knowledge of both the HTTP world and of the application world, so it is the go-between. It's the mapping layer. All knowledge of HTTP should stop at the controller, and everything that happens in the application beyond that should have no knowledge of HTTP. The controller is thin because it maps from HTTP land to application land. So what about the model? If looking at the controller as a mapping layer explains why, or justifies why the controller should be thin, then how does this pertain to the model? Coming back to the idea of a princess, this is totally tongue-in-cheek, but the model is actually a mapping layer as well. So we have this, say we have an action here, register action, user send welcome email. This is problematic because in the world of doctrine, we have these models, these model objects that hold state. But if you actually want to do something in the world of Symfony, you're going to need dependencies. And the two don't, dependencies and models don't, services and models, sorry, don't interact. I mean, you can't inject services into your model, and it's not built to work that way, and you shouldn't try to get it to work that way. So instead of having the user send the welcome email, we have the mailer send a welcome email to that user. This makes sense, right? In the Downton Abbey analogy, this would be, there'd be someone that works for the family who sends mail for them or something. So here we have application land on one side and then persistence land on the other side. So this would be your database, MongoDB or MySQL or whatever you use. And in between the two, there's a mapping layer, and that is your model. So the model maps from application land to persistence land. So now if we put this all together, we have HTTP land, we have a mapping layer between HTTP land and application land, and then we have another mapping layer between application land and persistence land. So we've identified two mapping layers, and both of those mapping layers should be thin because their responsibility is simply to map from one world into the other world. And who lives in application land? Thin controller, thin model, and then a fat service layer. That's how I build my applications. Another thing that I use a lot of is the event dispatcher. Application events, you should use them. With your event dispatcher, you should send an event whenever something happens. Like that. If that happened, then you'd send an event. And the events that you send are entirely up to you. You should send an event whenever Like, so if there's something that happens in your application, if you can phrase it in your mind, whenever this happens, that happens, there should be an event there. Okay? Whenever this happens, this just happened, that's an event. Something happened. An event happened. So raise an event there, dispatch an event, and then the second part of that sentence, whenever this happens, that happens, the that happens part is a listener listening to that event. So you can see how this will start to kind of unwind your application and decouple the different parts of it, because a listener, whenever this happens, that happens, so the that happening part is going to require dependencies, and those dependencies can be injected into that listener, but each of those individual happenings that happen inside of each listener, sorry if I'm using all these words too much, are going to have a discrete set of dependencies. So each of those listeners will have 2 or 3 dependencies tops, and you can easily unit test each of those listeners in isolation. So instead of kind of cramming all of this into your controller, which I see a lot when I audit people's code bases, there are humongous controllers. That's not the place for it. A controller is a mapping layer. It's just maps from HTTP over into your application land. And then all of the things that happen are in listeners. So here we have an event being triggered called user.username change. And whenever the username changes in Mongo, so we could go through and take that username and denormalize it. Mongo is a document-based storage system, so it's not you don't normalize your data into Mongo. You are free to denormalize so that you pull up one document and it has everything you need to present that particular view. So if the username is denormalized across many documents, whenever the username changes, you're going to want, if you allow the username to change, you're going to want to change it on all of the other documents. So that would be a listener, right? You see how I phrased that? Whenever the username changes, whenever this happens, that happens. And so that happening is updating all those denormalized usernames, and this is a listener. So typically I start with one event class for each model. So we've been talking about users. I would have a user event.php file. Inside of that class, there will be some constants for each of the events that are fired pertaining to a user. It accepts the object manager and then the object in question as arguments, and the event class has just very simple accessors to get at the data that's being curried around inside of that event. This is what triggering one of those events might look like whenever a user is created. New user event with the document manager and the user object, and then we dispatch this user create event. Or let's say a user is followed, so you'd have another event class that extends user event called user event. Perhaps you can think of a better name for it. So you'd have the document manager, the user, and then another user. And then the event name that you dispatch would be user.follow there. So the question remains, where are these, at what point in your application do you dispatch all of these events? If you're going to have multiple controllers processing forms and then flushing the document manager, so we need to find the right place to hook in so that we can universally, whenever a username changes, doesn't matter what controller it came out of, we need to fire the event, or whenever someone follows, whatever controller it might have come out of, we need to fire that event. So the place that I do that is the pre-flush. No? It's kind of gross, sorry. Pre-flush, before flush. There's an event in Doctrine that happens whenever you call flush on the object manager. There are a series of events that are fired inside of Doctrine, first being pre-flush, and then on-flush, and then pre-update on each individual document, and then post-flush. The reason I use pre-flush is this is before the change set is calculated. The way Doctrine works is that it's like a big brain. It's got something in there called the unit of work, which includes an identity map, and that identity map holds a reference to each object each persistent object, each model object that currently exists in memory. So it'll hold a reference to that, and then it also, after having fetched it from the database, holds a snapshot of what the data was, or what the data in the database are. So when you flush the object manager, it will compare the two, and it will come up with a change set. And using that change set, it will then construct an update query or multiple update queries to persist the changes that you've made to those objects in memory into the database. Okay, so the reason I use pre-flush is that it happens before the change set is calculated, and that gives us the freedom to make additional changes to the objects that we have in memory before the change set is calculated and the queries are run to update the database. What have we got here? Okay, so this is the pre-flush listener, which is a Doctrine listener, and from this Doctrine listener, we issue application events. So we're looking through that identity map at the different documents. If the document is a user, then there would be another method inside of this listener called process user flush, and inside of that process user flush method, we would implement the username change event, for example. So we would pull up the snapshot. We'd ask the unit of work for the original document data for this user object and compare it to the current value, the current username value of this user object. And if the username changed, then we would dispatch a username changed event. So this all happens in that pre-flush event. And then, like I was saying earlier, once you have these application events and you're able to organize your application, your business logic, or parts of your business logic around these events, you'll have these nice, clean listeners that are doing one very concise, precise thing. In this case, whenever a user is created, we add some activity to the system. So if there's an activity feed, this user just signed up, and we create that activity and then persist it. And since this event is being fired from the Doctrine pre-flush listener, we can persist a new document. This is happening before the change set is calculated, so we can persist a new document, and then Doctrine will pick it up and persist it just fine. We don't have to do any kind of fancy magic there. Here's another example. Whenever one user follows another user, we could take the user, get the user's stats, and then increment the number of followed users, and then the other user increment the number of followers. Easy. And then those changes that we've made into the documents will be caught by the Doctrine unit of work when it goes to compare the snapshot with the data in memory, and then the appropriate query would be run. So decouple your application by delegating work to clean, concise, single-purpose event listeners. All right, so far we've got model objects that are like princesses or Downton Abbey family, so they don't do much at all. They hold state. We have services that act upon those objects, and those services are often organized around inside of event listeners. So a service would be injected into an event listener. That event listener can be unit tested, the dependency mocked, and then that service can also be unit tested, any of its dependencies mocked as well. And that was Application events. Okay. So the last major section that I want to talk about, which moves away from the model, the mapping layer, and the application events, how all those fit together. This one's kind of off to the side. I call it contextual configuration, and you've seen a few examples of it already. But to me, this is saving your future self a headache. By default, the way you create a service in Symfony with the standard edition is by having a services.yaml file, or in this case, a widget.yaml file, and inside of that YAML file, defining your various services and defining their dependencies. My experience with this has been a headache. I've worked on applications where we've tried to organize, to create a widget.yaml file where anything that has to do with widgets is going to be in that one, and then another one where anything having to do with, feature X is in there. And then, forget about saving your future self a headache. Just right now, if you want to create a new service, you have to go through the hoop of thinking, okay, what's the right place for me to put this service definition? Should I create a new YAML file? It's a headache. It slows you down. You spend brain power on something that you really don't need to be spending your brain power on. And I will tell you the better way to do it in a minute. The other thing I want to point out is that when I talk about saving your future self a headache, if down the line you say, remove the logger, you're working in the PHP class, the widget twiddler class, and you remove the logger, maybe let's just say you remove it altogether. If you don't change this, the logger is still going to be added as that second argument. So if you make a change, then you have to think, okay, what else do I need to change in order so that my application knows about the change that I made to the class? And like I said, spending a lot of brain power on something that you shouldn't be. So the solution is this bundle here, the DI extra bundle. This bundle gives you these great annotations that you can use to define services contextual to the classes of those services. So in this case, this would do the same thing as the YAML that I just showed you. We have a service here called widget twiddler. We don't need to tell the container what the class name is, because the container will figure out the class name based on reflection of this particular file. And then the second annotation there, inject params, we don't need to tell in this case, we don't need to tell the container which services to pull, because I have services, a service called dispatcher and a service called logger. I don't have to tell the container that the logger is an optional dependency, because it'll see that there is a default value for that argument. So for that auto wiring, that's what it's called when you put inject params, and then the container is able to figure out which services to inject. That's based around some aliases that I create. So for the major services in my application, I always use the same variable names inside of my classes. So if I need to inject the container for some reason, or whenever I inject the dispatcher or security context, I'll use these shorter variable names, and then the container will know to inject that service because of the alias. So I provide a little bit of glue usually in config.yaml, define these aliases, and it saves me a lot of time. In the case where you don't want to create an alias, back here in the annotation, you would just provide a hash as you can pass a hash into the inject params, where on the left is the variable name, and on the right is the service ID. So you don't need to create an alias for every single service. require.js. Who's used require.js? Good. So this falls. This is another good example of contextual configuration. In require.js, I don't see require.js as a loader as much as I do a dependency injection container for JavaScript. If you've used it, you probably know what I'm talking about. But once I discovered require.js, it's like the clouds kind of parted, and then I was able to start writing JavaScript code that was clean and well organized because I'm used to using a service container, a dependency injection container in PHP. So I could start applying those same principles to JavaScript. And require.js is, in my opinion, the best implementation of a dependency injection container in JavaScript that I've come across. And you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to this guy. This is what some of the code might look like. You need to configure require at the top of every page here. So we provided some services. I'll call them services, jQuery, underscore, and backbone. And if those JavaScript libraries aren't packaged as modules in the JavaScript lingo, then you can create shims for them here. And the paths up at the top is the same as the aliases that I was creating in for the Symfony container. Now we're doing the same for the JavaScript container. This is what a service definition will look like. So we have, we're defining model/user here based on the file name. We define its dependencies, underscore, and backbone. Those dependencies will be injected in the same order that they're defined there. So the first argument that comes into that closure is underscore, and the second argument is backbone. And then the value that the closure returns is the model/user service. So in this case, we have a little template inline there just for demonstration purposes. And then we return a backbone model. So this is another example of contextual configuration, because as you can see, the configuration for what services are to be injected into that closure are just above it. So if you remove backbone from this service, then you would also remove backbone from that array at the top. Backbone would no longer be loaded, it would no longer be injected. And then at the top of inside of your actual template files, you would have a little bit of initialization JavaScript just to get values passed in that you need to have generated out of PHP. In this case, the user object is being serialized there and passed into the model, and then the element is being grabbed from the DOM. So we are including the view/user service and the model/user service. And as you saw earlier, the model requires backbone and underscore. The view requires backbone and jQuery. But the template, this code right here, doesn't have any reference to backbone, jQuery, or underscore, because all of those dependencies are defined in the context of those JavaScript modules that use them. So if you need to make a change to one of those modules, you only need to pay attention to the code that's in front of you. You don't have to think, okay, where did I include this JavaScript, and then go through and make sure that you remove it, and what if in the meantime there's something else that's also using it? This is the glory of contextual configuration. If you remove it, if you're not using it here anymore, you take it off, and then require.js will figure out the rest for you. So I know that I wrote aesthetic. I don't know how these two worlds will meet. It's something that I want to talk to anyone who's interested in talking about it at the conference here. Catch me in the hallway today or tomorrow. But this is an example of what is not contextual configuration. So we have in our template, we create the user view, we pass in the user data, and we grab that element. And then up at the top, we have all of these libraries that we're pulling in, and we don't really know why. So going back to that model from before, if we changed our model so it doesn't use Backbone anymore, it uses something else, maybe something that implements the same API, but it's not Backbone. So up here, we're including Backbone, but if we took Backbone out of the user view and then replaced it with something else, then we would need to, put whatever the replacement is there. But I don't know if I can remove Backbone because maybe there's something else buried inside of user view that uses it, or inside of user. The dependencies are not defined in the context of the code that uses them in this case. So it's problematic. Contextual configuration allows unused dependencies to just naturally slough off. Require.js just won't load them if you're not using them. You saw me the user serialize bit there. Again, this is another point of contextual configuration. You define how an object is serialized in the context of that object. Again, using annotations. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of annotations. I use annotations to define the mapping, the metadata, how a particular model object is mapped into the database, how an object is serialized. It makes the code very clean, as you can see here. We have that serialization, the serialization rules defined in the user class. All we do is pass it into that serialized filter and make sure that Twig doesn't escape the JavaScript, the JSON object, and there we are. A few more kittens, so that you guys don't fall asleep on me. Kittens looking up. Okay. Miscellaneous, this is just a few things that I thought I'd tack on to the end. I mentioned earlier the idea of organizing your code in different bundles. For me, I've always, because I've got this need to do things right, and this is one of those gray areas. When is the right time to start a new bundle? I've seen it done wrong. I've seen people just do everything in one bundle. I've seen people create a new bundle and it's only got one class in it. Don't do that. So here's a few guidelines for you. Anything that's reusable, so something that you might eventually open source, or that you don't have to plan to open source it, but if you can think of it in terms of, oh, this is a discrete piece of functionality that could be reused, then that becomes your rule for what goes in that bundle. Anything that has to do with that. And reusable often means doesn't have dependencies on other bundles within your application. So it would need to there would need to be the glue that configures it inside of your configuration for that bundle. If there's lots of classes relating to one feature, you can organize all those into one bundle. If you have a new project that's integrating with a new third-party service, then you can create a new bundle for that third-party service and have all the tests in there, and then when it's ready, merge it into your project. This is another good indication of when it's a good time to create a bundle. I like nice, short, concise names. So this one, main bundle, account, widget, sidebar. This is how I would create it. I'd have, if there's an account section, and then inside of the account section, there's a widget page or something, and then inside that widget page, I have different templates. So I wouldn't call it widget sidebar html.twig because that's too big. I don't like a name that big. That widget part should be a directory, and the sidebar should be inside of that directory. But this is a good indication that you might create an account bundle here. So whenever you see slashes or template names are getting long, think about reorganizing those template files inside of multiple bundles. I want to touch on access control. The Symfony ACL, it's great that Symfony has an ACL. This is for arbitrary permissions. It's not it's not the only solution for authorization inside of the Symfony framework. This is an example of what arbitrary permissions look like. If your application doesn't include this kind of matrix, you probably don't want to use the ACL. If you find yourself creating, so say a user just created a new blog post and you want that user to have permission to edit that blog post, so you therefore create an entry on the blog post ACL, you're probably doing it wrong, because that's logic. If the blog post was created by that user, then that user has access to edit it. So the tool you want to use inside of Symfony is something called a voter. And that voter, you create a new voter class and implement your authorization logic inside of that class. It's a lot easier than dealing with the ACL. So this is an example of a voter. Say we have a widget and we want to implement that owner attribute on the widget. This is some boilerplate implementation of the voter interface. And then inside it would look like this. The important part being that if statement toward the bottom. If the token user is the widget user, then access is granted, right? It's that simple. You don't need to add an entry to your ACL every time a user creates a widget. You can implement it using logic. And once you implement your authorization logic like that, then you have another JMS bundle that you can use, the security extra bundle, which provides, of course, annotations. And you can do something like this on your action. If the widget, the edit action, we can just add this simple annotation at the top so that only someone with owner permissions on that widget will have access to this action. Otherwise, an error will be thrown. Same thing inside of Twig templates. Another rule of thumb, no query builders outside of repositories. Similar to the idea of how the controller is that barrier between the HTTP land and application land, and the application has no knowledge of HTTP. The repository, it has knowledge of how objects are persisted in the database, but anything outside of that repository should not have any knowledge of that. So if you take a look at this class, it includes two methods in this repository. And if you build your application with all query builders inside of the repository, the other benefit, and it takes a little time to analyze, but you can read through this and figure out what indexes you need. If all of your query builders are spread out across your application, they're in controllers there and something else over there, you really don't have, it's a much more arduous process to go through and audit what indexes your application needs, if there are some that you don't need anymore. If all of your query builders are inside of the repository, that process is much easier. Eager ID creation, this one's simple. In Mongo, you have this Mongo ID you can create eagerly so that you don't have to save something to the database in order to get its ID back. There's a few other things you want to do you can do inside of the constructors. Created at, just do that inside of your constructor. There's no need to use an annotation and involve a listener for that. You just do it there. And also within Doctrine, any kind of collection needs to be an instance of the array collection there. And don't forget your clone constructor. There's two ways to create objects inside of PHP: with the new keyword, where you say new and then provide a class name, or with the clone keyword, where you say clone and provide an object. So these are brother and sister, new and clone, and they both have constructors that are called depending on which keyword you use. So the __ clone method, think of that as a constructor, and think of the same things that you thought of inside of the new keyword constructor, inside of the clone keyword constructor. When they're side by side, they should be quite similar. So if you clone an object, you're going to want to give it a new Mongo ID. You're, depending on what you're doing, set a new created at timestamp. And then also, you're going to want to dereference those two array collections, because if you have a user object and the user has many, I don't know, addresses, when you copy that user object and clone that, that addresses collection is not cloned as well. So you're going to need to handle that dereferencing. Simple things: save space on file name, on field names. In Mongo, Mongo does not have a formal schema like you do in MySQL. Or any relational database, you define columns on a table, and so all those column names are saved once somewhere. In Mongo, there is no schema, so every document includes every field name that is in that document. So if you had username stored in every document, and if you're going to have millions and millions of users, that's a lot of space that you don't need to be using. So you can provide this short field name U and save yourself some space. I alluded to this earlier: only flush from the controller. This ties into into limiting the areas of your application that have knowledge of persistence. The controller has knowledge of persistence. It asks doctrine for certain objects, and then it has the application make changes to those objects, and then it asks doctrine to flush those changes down to the database. Only flush from the controller. Something like this. Makes a lot of sense, right? If you need to skedaddle your widgets. And no proxy objects. This one is interesting. This is a feature of Doctrine. You can create a proxy object. So in the case of Mongo, that proxy object would be a reference. So if you're referencing a user from another document, and then you load up that other document, and it's magic. You don't have to run another query to get that user. There's a proxy object that includes the document manager, hidden inside of it, and then you can call the methods on that user object, and the first time the user object is accessed, then it'll go ahead and run that query to load its data, and you can use it like normal. The problem here is that it's magic, and the motto of Symfony 2 has always been kill the magic, right? So don't use these. Instead, if you're going to be loading up something that includes a reference to a user, and you want that user loaded in, and for whatever reason you're using a reference there instead of denormalizing user data to this object, then go through the steps necessary to load in that data for that particular case in an optimal way. If you're loading users, if you have, let's say, a list of addresses, just because it's on my mind, and each address has a reference to a user, then if you iterate over all those addresses, it's going to be an n+1 query situation. So you're going to know that that's what you're using the data for, and ahead of time you can query all of those users in an optimal way and already have them, and then load them into your objects. So you might have something like this inside of that model object. Okay. Any questions? Hold on. Let me see. Oh, we have a break after this. 20, 40. Okay, I'm late anyways, so let's do three questions. Sure.
Don't you think that annotations in a model for GMS serializer is an anti-pattern to a princess thing? Because model, I think should not know how it will be serialized.
The princess thing would be to ask the model to give me all your data as an array. It'd be like a to-array function.
Well, yeah, but it's almost the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for me, contextual configuration wins just because of ease of use.
Okay, thanks.
explicitly in some place where you know that you will need to iterate over addresses and fetch user, you can just do explicit join. I don't know.
So the question was, why would you avoid proxy objects?
When we were speaking about events,
Wait. Someone asked me a question. I don't know who's talking right now. So to answer your question, why would you not use proxy objects when you can just do the same thing and basically have proxy objects to fall back on? Is that what you're saying? Because that kind of magic can kind of sneak in. I'd rather know from the beginning what's happening inside of my application and then do it in a proper way. Wow, someone's calling me. So again, like one of the things that I like about this talk is that, well, two things. No one else can do this talk, right? And I can't be wrong, right? So this is how I do it. I don't use proxy objects because for me, I would rather know from the beginning what's happening when I call this method, and if I call something and I haven't loaded in those data, then I'd like an exception thrown.
Well, yeah, sometimes you trade off magic for performance, and you just have to know that there's some magic so you can win performance.
Mm-hmm.
Just in my opinion. But it's
All right. You can say that in your talk.
when you were speaking about events, you showed us an example of get stats method from the user. I assume that stats is an entity related to user, and it would trigger an additional select at pre-flush.
In that particular case, it's an embedded document inside of Mongo, so there's
Okay.
no.
But if it would be an SQL, it would trigger an additional select. Am I right or not?
Right, and so in that case, if it is SQL, then you might have a service that manages stats, and you'd say, instead of saying get stats on the model, you'd ask that service to change stats for this user.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I get it. Thank you.
Hello,
my
Kris,
gosh.
I'm here.
Oh,
There are two confusing points for me. First point, it's about dependency injection. At the very beginning of dependency injection component, interface injection stuff has been removed from a component, but you removed it back via the extra bundle. How you can explain this?
it's not the same. Interface injection is the container would look at your class, and if there's a setter method on that interface, then it would inject a service via that setter, and you could define interfaces inside of your service configuration. That's really not what interfaces are meant for. Interfaces should be used when consuming something, or if you depend on something, you can, for consuming or for using something, not for configuring something. So an interface injection is, in my mind, an anti-pattern. I mean, I've seen it implemented and used effectively. So, but DI extra is not interface injection. You're providing metadata to the container as to how to configure that particular service.
Okay, I see. Thank you for once. And the second point is about magic. You ask us to do not use proxy because it's magic in one hand. In other hand, you asking to use listeners, but listeners is magic as well. Because if you build your application through listeners, for your logic, it will be mess of listeners with priorities. And I think a listener is magic itself. So what explanation will be?
I don't think listeners are magic.
Okay, thank you.
All right. In your opinion, you said something like annotations is a way to help keep Princess slim.
Did I say annotations?
Yeah. So it is like, or it's not, because let's say you've got a situation when you have a 10 or 7 annotations per property and entity, and you know it looks like alright, slim princess, but in a fat-looking dress, isn't it?
Touche. Yeah, again, the contextual configuration wins for me. That's really valuable. Just in having been on long-lived projects where there's a lot of configuration mess over here. I call it configuration spaghetti. And when you have the configuration contextual to what it is configuring, it's much less of a headache. So contextual configuration wins for me. And also that the configuration is the princess is still unaware of the configuration that's on those methods and those properties and up on the class. It's in the file, it's contextual, but you know, I don't know, maybe the princess has like an operation instructions sticker on her hip.
I have one question.
I have 2 questions. One is which ID do you use and why? And
IDE?
ID. And second, even listeners are pretty, they are clean solution, but what's the performation of this? Because you can have, for example, 100 events, and all the time, all the requests is all auto-loaded, I think. What's with this?
No, I mean the event dispatcher is built to lazily load listeners. So those listeners wouldn't be called from the container unless the event was fired. That's one. If you have, you could look at adding another delegation layer if there's certain circumstances when I don't know. I mean, we already have this in the pre-flush listener, but unless if you run into a situation when you have so many listeners in your dispatcher that it's causing a performance problem just to add that array each time, then that sounds like an edge case to me. But this is where I start. If there's a performance problem like that, then I'd look at it and come up with a solution. But looking at that at the beginning of your project, I think would be premature optimization. I use Sublime Text too. I used to use TextMate just because I don't know why. I don't like the feel of the Eclipse things that they have all the panels all over, and then so I sacrifice some auto completion and just I use Sublime.
Hi, I got a question. Last one. It will be a quick one. Okay, so I noticed that you love the Johannes Schmidt bundles, and DI extra bundle is pretty cool, but still it is kind of messy and kind of debug horrible to check what happens on the server, which is running PHP 5.3.27 or something like that, and each time the injections by the annotations get, pardon my French, fucked.
Is that a French word? I don't know what you're talking about, man. I don't know. Come ask me afterwards. It works for me. Thank you, everyone, so much. Let me.